She was 6 years old, crowned beneath a cathedral dome that swallowed the sky, taller than any tree she'd ever seen, echoing with hymns in a language she didn't understand. Her dress was stiff with jewels, her tiny head bowed under the weight of a golden crown, heavier than anything she had ever carried. She blinked at the sea of faces, all watching, none asking. Next to her stood her husband, a man of 29, eyes sunken, beard streaked with gray, cloaked not just in royal silk but in the weariness of kingship. He took her hand, and somewhere far behind the altar, an organ moaned. This was not a wedding. This was diplomacy in silk shoes. Peace inked not on parchment, but on a child's flesh, and no one, not one soul in that cathedral, asked if the bride understood her own wedding. This is the story of Isabelle of France. Not a warrior, not a schemer, not a ruler in command, but a little girl, born into the rotting heart of monarchy, the youngest daughter of a mad king and a calculating queen, a child taught to curtsy before she could walk, to suffer before she could speak. France was bleeding, fractured by war with England, tormented by the paranoia of its own crown, and as the armies marched and the nobles whispered, a solution was conjured in the cold chambers of power: peace for a price. The ink dried on the treaty in 1396. The price was Isabelle, 6 years old, promised to Richard II, the aging King of England, in return a 28-year truce and a dowry worth the treasury of a nation, a child for a kingdom. Wrapped in silk and silence, Isabelle would never know a childhood, only rituals, negotiations and grief wrapped in lace. Her body became a treaty, her tears irrelevant, her fate sealed. But how does a girl survive when the world does not see her as a person at all? Isabelle was born into whispers. The year was 1389, and within the ornate halls of the Louvre Palace, her first cries echoed not as a celebration, but as a complication. France was already splintering, bleeding from internal rot and foreign war. Outside the palace, the 100 Years' War loomed like a curse, but inside there was a quieter horror. Her father, King Charles VI of France, once the fair and beloved, had already begun to unravel. Madness crept through his mind like mold in a locked room. One day, he believed he was made of glass, fragile, transparent, breakable. Courtiers were ordered not to touch him. Iron rods were sewn into his clothes to keep him from shattering. Servants followed him through the marble corridors with cushions in case he fell. He screamed at mirrors. He wept in corners. He forgot his children's names. France called him Charles the Mad. His court called him Your Majesty. His daughter called him nothing at all, because he was never truly there. The Queen, Isabelle of Bavaria, met this madness with ice. Where her husband cracked, she calcified. Ambitious and cunning, she grasped for power with a velvet fist. Her children, including Isabelle, were less heirs than they were currency, pawns on a chessboard drawn in blood and ink. The nursery was not a place of warmth, it was a holding pen for future bargaining chips. France itself reflected the sickness of its rulers. Two great factions tore the kingdom apart: the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. Nobles slit throats behind tapestries, while peasants starved in fields salted by marching boots. The royal family, meanwhile, drank wine behind gilded gates, hosting masquerades while the streets rotted outside. And amid this crumbling empire stood Isabelle, too young to read, too delicate to fight, but just old enough to be offered. In 1396, when she was barely 6 years old, a letter arrived that would decide her fate. England, the eternal enemy, was bleeding too. Richard II, their king, was desperate for peace, or at least the illusion of it. He proposed a marriage, himself, nearly 30. The bride, little Isabelle. In return, a truce spanning nearly 3 decades, and a dowry so vast it could finance an army. There were objections, of course, from clergymen, from nobles, from those few with a shred of decency. But in a world ruled by men drunk on power and mothers drunk on ambition, decency was disposable. Isabelle was measured in coin, weighed against kingdoms, and found suitable. She did not understand. How could she? Her tutors spoke of duty. Her mother dressed her in velvet. Her nurses wept when they thought she couldn't hear. And the crown, oh, the crown was forged not for a child's head but for a nation's lie. When the deal was struck, she was not told of treaties or politics. She was simply fitted for a new dress and taught to smile when it hurt. Her journey to England would be grand, but its purpose was simple: a sacrificial procession, not for gods but for kings too tired to fight and too greedy to wait. And so Isabelle, the silent child of a shattering king and a frozen queen, was prepared, not for marriage, for surrender. The day of Isabelle's departure was veiled in frost. The river Seine moved like dull silver beneath a gray sky, and the palace walls that had once imprisoned her now loomed with an unfamiliar ache. She was leaving not just her home but the last fragile threads of her childhood. Her father, lucid for a flickering moment, kissed her hand with trembling lips. His eyes were glassy, not from delusion but from the unbearable weight of clarity. Her mother, Queen Isabelle, did not cry. She stood like stone, offered a cold blessing and turned away. There was no softness, just duty. Isabelle's small hands clutched at a few final belongings, a carved wooden doll, a tiny silk pouch of herbs, and the leash of a small lapdog who would outlive her husband. She carried no sense of finality, only the quiet hope that this was temporary, a ceremonial journey, a test of obedience, something she could return from. No one told her otherwise. The journey to England was cloaked in pomp and absurd reverence, cities lined with gawking crowds, lords bowing before a girl whose feet barely touched the floor. In Calais, where the sea met foreign ambition, she boarded a ship for a land she had never seen. English nobles awaited her like anxious merchants, inspecting a rare jewel. They smiled with reverence, but behind their eyes flickered unease. Even for them this was grotesque. When Isabelle arrived in London, she was paraded like a treasure through the capital. Thousands lined the streets, flowers thrown, bells rung, but beneath the celebration was something hollow, a strange dissonance between the grandeur and the reality of the small, pale-faced girl on horseback. At St. Paul's Cathedral, the wedding unfolded under vaults that swallowed sound and light alike. The organ groaned, the Latin hymns rose like smoke. Isabelle stood beside King Richard II, whose expression wavered between sorrow and shame. He had agreed to this, he had signed the documents, but as he took her hand, rough and calloused against her trembling fingers, he saw not a wife but a child. She did not weep, she simply stood, like a relic, a living parchment onto which an entire kingdom's hope had been scrawled. In the months that followed, Richard treated Isabelle not as a queen, nor as a consort, but as a daughter cloaked in royal silks. She was given a wing of the palace, French tutors, dolls carved from ivory, painted screens, musicians, scribes, a playground in a golden cage. He would sit with her at meals, ask about her dog, read her stories from illuminated texts. The marriage, though legal, was not consummated, perhaps the only grace left in this theater of politics. There was peace for a moment, or at least the illusion of it. Isabelle learned to speak in English whispers, learned to smile on command. For a while the war paused, but peace, like porcelain, is beautiful only when unbroken, and soon cracks spidered through the surface. In 1399, Richard left on a military campaign. He never returned. Henry Bolingbroke, a rival with steel ambition and royal blood, seized the throne in Richard's absence. When the king returned, he was arrested, dethroned, and then disappeared. The rumors came first: imprisonment, exile, then the truth followed like rot. Richard had been murdered. Some say he starved, others say he was bludgeoned with a poker in a locked chamber. Isabelle was 10, and she was no longer a queen, just a widow in a foreign court. Her dowry vanished, her title erased, her future, once gilded, now dissolved into political ash. The English crown had no further use for her. The pageantry faded, the silks turned to veils, and the golden cage became a cold one. Isabelle of France, once the child bride of England, now stood alone, not a wife, not a queen, not even a girl anymore, only a shadow. The girl who had once worn a crown now lived behind locked gates. After Richard's death, Isabelle was not returned to her family. Instead, she was kept like a valuable artifact the new king didn't know where to place. Henry IV had seized power with blood and urgency, and the French princess, once a diplomatic prize, became an awkward remnant of the old regime. Too young to pose a threat, too royal to simply discard. So she was hidden. They sent her to Havering Palace, a cold, isolated manor surrounded by damp woods and loyal guards. It was not a dungeon. There were no chains, no iron bars. Her bed was feathered, her dresses clean, the food brought hot. But the silence was endless. The doors always closed. The world reduced to corridors and courtyards and the low moan of wind through stone. She was 12 now, but already ancient inside. Her letters, when they were allowed to leave the manor, were carved with pain disguised in politeness. She wrote to her family in France in the language of courtiers, but between the lines spilled desperation. "I write to you in tears," she confessed. "I am kept like a prisoner, far from all I love." The child once displayed to crowds was now hidden from them. The English court offered no answers, only silence, and the occasional stiff visit from a noble who bowed too deeply and left too soon. Isabelle's body had grown, but her soul remained bruised. Every day she walked the same stone paths. Every evening she sat by a frost-touched window and watched the sky bleed into dusk. Her dog had died. Her tutors grew old. She remembered less of France, and each year fewer letters came. Across the channel, her father, King Charles VI, still reigned, though madness had claimed more of him. But in flashes of rare lucidity, he demanded her return. Perhaps he remembered her face. Perhaps he saw his own guilt written across her exile. Whatever sanity he possessed was offered to the cause of bringing Isabelle home. And at last, in 1401, a deal was made. She returned to France, not in triumph but in hushed formality. The girl who had left as a queen came back as something undefined. No crown, no husband, no dowry, only memory. Paris welcomed her not with bells but with silence. She was not needed now. The truce had crumbled. War crept back into France's bones. Isabelle was simply another piece of debris left behind by failed diplomacy. The French court barely looked at her. She had aged in ways they did not understand. Her voice had lowered, not in tone but in trust. She no longer smiled for strangers. She did not cry easily. She spoke when spoken to, and in her eyes lived the ghost of a child who had watched her innocence signed away with royal ink. She had been a queen, she had been a widow, and now she was neither. Just a girl again, but not quite, not anymore. There are kinds of love that bloom not in sunshine, but in the soft soil left behind by grief. At 16, Isabelle was allowed to marry again, but this time it was not forced upon her. Not a crown in exchange for a truce, not a man twice her age, no archbishop raising her hand like a scepter. This time it was choice, or something near it. His name was Charles of Orleans, a boy of 15, a poet with eyes like ink and words that hummed like hymns. He was a prince, but more importantly, he was kind. France hoped for a political bond. What grew instead was something far rarer, a quiet mutual affection. They spoke not only of courtly things but of music and dreams. He read her poems in the garden. She laughed with the same mouth that once spoke only in whispers. With Charles, Isabelle was no longer a pawn but a person. It was not the love of fairy tales, but it was something better, real, earned. They were both too familiar with loss to expect happiness, so what they shared became sacred in its smallness. Moments, not monuments, soft hands, warm beds, shared books. In a world still ruled by steel and politics, their love was a rebellion, silent, personal and powerful. But peace has never lingered long in Isabelle's life. In 1407, Charles rode to battle and did not return. Captured by the English, the same land that had once caged her, he was dragged into a distant imprisonment that would last 25 years. Their love, so briefly realized, was torn apart by the very war she had once been traded to prevent. She was alone again, but not the same girl who had wept behind stained glass. This Isabelle stood straighter now, not because she was unbroken, but because she had learned to carry every fracture. In 1409 she gave birth to their daughter, a child born not out of politics but poetry. The baby cried with lungs that had never known silence, and for a moment Isabelle must have thought the curse was lifting, but her body, weary and worn from years of cold stone, long corridors and royal expectations, could not bear the weight. She died within the year, just 20 years old. No royal procession, no cathedral bells, no national mourning. Her death passed like a breath, soft, tragic, and unnoticed by the world that had once dressed her in gold and called her queen. They buried her in a quiet tomb, marked with a name she had barely begun to grow into. Isabelle d'Orléans, not queen, not empress, just Isabelle. She had lived 2 lifetimes in the span of one, a bride at 6, a widow at 10, a prisoner at 12, a wife at 16, a mother at 20, and now a memory. Even in death she remained what she had always been, a symbol carved from flesh, used by nations, forgotten by history. But in that brief flickering moment with Charles she had chosen, she had loved, and in the end it was the only piece of her life that belonged to her alone. Centuries have passed, thrones have crumbled, empires risen and burned, and the names of kings echo faintly in dusty ledgers. But if you listen closely, in the silence between cathedral bells, in the footnotes of war chronicles, in the forgotten corners of royal archives, you might still hear her, not her voice, that was taken early, but the echo of her absence. Isabelle of France is not remembered for ruling. She never issued a decree, never led an army, never wore her crown beyond its ceremonial weight. She did not command. Her name does not live in the lineage of kings, but in the margins, in treaties and dowries and records of royal expense. She was a signature in a marriage contract, a possession exchanged for a pause in bloodshed, a living body offered like a chalice at the altar of diplomacy. and yet she endures, because in her silence there is a scream, in her captivity a warning, in her short life a reflection of the cost of peace when it is forged in flesh. She was a child made bride, a queen made ghost, a girl made into parchment, and though the world buried her quietly, though no bards sang her name in court, though her tomb was never visited by those who once called her Majesty, she remains, as a shadow cast over every political marriage dressed as mercy, as a reminder of the girls whose bodies became borders, as a ghost with a crown far too large for her skull. Not all sacrifices are glorious. Some are 6 years old, and still bleeding 6 centuries later.